So I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us this morning. I hope you can hear me through the microphone. My name is Robert Wall Emerson. I'll be the MC of our time here today. We have a small party here in person, a larger party virtually. We are here to hear Sarah Elizabeth Baguhn elucidate for us aspects of assessment in orientation and mobility as a culmination for her doctoral work. What we'll do today is Sarah Elizabeth will go through her presentation. At the end of the presentation, there'll be a time for any of the people in person or online to ask questions. It's not just the committee, but anyone who's here. So keep your questions to the end, please. After a short question and answer period, we will ask everyone to clear out except for the committee. The committee will meet, and then we'll ask Sarah Elizabeth to come back in and we'll have a little meeting with her, and then things will be concluded. So those of you who are viewing, who are not on the committee and who are not Sarah Elizabeth, after the general question and answer, you will be excused and you'll have to find out what happened afterwards. All right, with that, Sarah Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Rob. I want to invite all of you to think back on a time when you took a test in your life, maybe in your childhood or maybe as an adult, and it felt like something about the test was unfair. How would that experience, how would the activities that came after it have gone differently for you if you'd been given a fair shot in the beginning? Kids who are blind or visually impaired live in a world dominated by visual tests and cited norms. In setting up for this study, the background, the field believes that early orientation and mobility intervention is crucial. Vision motivates movement. It stimulates children to have a reason to develop their mobility skills. The existing tests in this area have been insufficient. They've been developed for kids with vision and based on those cited norms. Looking at what was sort of available at the time, looking back 4 years ago now when this project started, the New Mexico Orientation and Mobility Skills Inventory stood out in the field as one of the best available tools. It used an Excel workbook to track children's scores and progress. It included report templates that made it very accessible and approachable for professionals to use. It covered a long list of skills that included early orientation and mobility type activities. And it was put together by a team of orientation and mobility specialists, physical therapists. Dr. Dawn Anderson worked on that. So a group really put their heads together and tried to be intentional about covering the sorts of assessment that would be helpful and important for the field. They also took the time to develop for it a sensitive scoring system. So making sure that instead of just marking plus, minus, or yes, no, the child can do something, it was responding to the development as it happened. Did the child just begin to do something? Were they doing it some of the time, or were they really consistently performing the skill throughout? As I looked at researching a better tool to make an assessment that would be fair for kids who are blind and visually impaired, it was important to define what would a good tool look like? What would be the keys to a better tool? We would want that tool to be reliable. It should have a consistency in its measurement. We would want that tool to be valid. It should measure what it claims to measure. We'd want it to be sensitive so that the rate of true positives reflected the true positives in the population. We'd also want it to be sensitive in the sense that a change in the score would happen whenever there was a small change in the child's performance. And ideally, we would want the test to be usable in a high-stakes environment. it would need to have reliability and validity strong enough that a single test score could serve as a snapshot of how the child was doing with that skill. So that brought me to my first study, which was to explore the validity of the orientation and mobility assessment using a Delphi study. The purpose of this study was to determine the face validity and expert content validity of the birth to 6 orientation and mobility skills inventory, or the new tool being created with insights from the New Mexico. And you can find this QR code will take you to the full paper on this subject. The research questions for this first study were, does the B6OMSI test all relevant areas of orientation and mobility for very young children? The point here is the test comprehensive? Does it measure all of the domains that our professionals teach? It looked at, are all of the items on the B6OMSI contributing to the total picture of a child's orientation and mobility skills? We wanted to rule out that anything extraneous would be on that test because that would waste professionals' valuable service time. And we wanted to know if the validity could be established to an appropriate level for a high-stakes test. So could this be a snapshot, or would it always need to be used in conjunction with more informal assessments, data gathered from many different sources, that sort of thing? To explore this, I used a Delphi study, which helps establish the scope of practice for the test, because overall, the scope of practice for orientation and mobility is very wide, and we tend to individualize for each client. We needed to know what professionals would find useful with young children, and asking a team of expert professionals is one way to answer that question. The Delphi study uses a repeated survey model where it goes back over and over to the same pool of experts, anonymizing the feedback that they're giving and trying to have them discuss until they reach a point of consensus. That means that the resulting tool would be appropriate, and we can answer the questions about what needs to be included on it, even when the literature doesn't already establish those boundaries. In conducting the Delphi study, I recruited 24 experts who've completed all of the rounds of the study. 21 were from the US, and there were 3 from other countries. All of them had experience in the birth to 6-year-old service area, and most also had experience with older individuals, which is helpful in keeping in perspective what skills need to be developed in early childhood to get kids ready for their performance later on. This pool of participants also included people in both rural and urban settings, because we know that traveling in a city is not the same as traveling in a rural area. Different skills are needed, and it would be good to have a test that was inclusive of that whole range. To conduct the Delphi study, round 1 first recruited orientation and mobility skills experts, and gathered information from them using open-ended questions and topics to prompt. So I asked them about what sort of things would they like to test in a child, like a baby who's not yet crawling, who has low vision. What sort of things would they like to test in a 6-year-old who has total blindness? Those different areas of questions help to make sure that they were covering the full spectrum of the types of kids that we serve in that population. They generated 1,230 suggestions that were then qualitatively coded. So like items or similar items were grouped together into consolidated sets. And that was done using the pre-established codes from the New Mexico, and also allowing for emergent codes. So when the group of professionals suggested something that was not on New Mexico's tool, there was room to expand the boundary and add those things in as well. Then rounds 2 and 3 sent that information back out to the experts and asked them, given this list, would you still include these things? tell us why, tell each other why not, and listen to what each other are saying. Through that process of discussion, we ask the experts to vote again and again until they come to a solid consensus on what should be included. Items that were above the 90% agreement were kept in the question pool. Each response went through a decision tree to decide whether it was in support of an item or in opposition to an item, and then consolidated or categorized and sent back out for the third round. Any item that was in that undecided range went back out a third time. And in the end, the group agreed on almost all of the items, except for the use of technology. This led to 31 measurable items being included and validated for the test. 7 new items were generated through that process, and the assessment question has now been included on the background information page of the B6OMSI and the B6OMSI Research Edition, so that those professionals who find technology relevant to their service for young children have some place to document and track that, and those who work in an area or culture where that's not appropriate are not finding their children scored down because of the local culture. Once a scope of validity was established for what to include on the test, the next question I came to was, is this test reliable? Does this score have any stability? Does it measure the same thing time and time again? This is important because historically we haven't had much in the way of reliable tests, especially in early O&M. Reliability is really important for progress monitoring because you can't compare the score if you can't trust that you would get the same score for the same performance every time. It's also functionally necessary to futuring this research because we need to trust that multiple evaluators would get the same score if they saw the same performance. Otherwise, the only way to create a data set would be for one evaluator to do all of the assessments, and that pretty quickly becomes a problem of scale. Finally, since reliability was being explored, I looked at the split half measures of internal reliability as an early approximation of the test's reliability, at least according to classical test theory. In this study, my research questions focused around those 3 types of reliability. The inter-rater reliability, I wanted to know if it was appropriate for at least research, which is usually a 70% threshold, or good enough for even high stakes assessment, which usually requires a 90% or better reliability. I looked at test-retest reliability, which is so critical for progress monitoring. That would need a threshold of 85% to be useful in that domain. And then also explored which of the scales might have split half reliability, because that's a good early indicator of which scales might actually be statistical scales. In order to gather this data, it was important to look at the test scores from real kids in the real world. So data were collected on children by their own O&M specialists. I worked with each O&M specialist to train them on the tool first. In all, 35 kids were tested for this study. 9 of them had a separate scorer sit in and observe a test session and score it separately for inter-rater reliability. 13 kids were retested at some point during the process, and so they have multiple test scores in the pool to compare their test and retests. And in total, with all of that testing, 54 test books were collected. To analyze this, Spearman's Row and Spearman-Brown correlations were used because the distribution of the sample was non-parametric. And then we got to see the really cool results. So looking just initially at the average scores for the test and the scales, I see that the students generally were averaging kind of between 40 and 48. But more interesting, the minimum score on every scale was 20. So we had kids at their very beginning of development included in this sample. And the highest scores go all the way up to 99 on some scales. So we had some kids top out on some of the scales. And on other scales got up into the 70s and 80s. So we had pretty good coverage of child performance, though not quite as heavy on the top end performers. Not a whole lot of ceiling effect going on here. Those mean scores also increased with age, which is really important for the assumptions of a test. We would want a developmental test to give a higher score to an older child in most cases. Children should get more skills as they age. And it was also comparable across subgroups, which we'll talk more about later. For the inter-rater reliability, I started by plotting out the test scores for each child, and I noticed that the scores from the researcher and from the child's own O&M specialist are pretty close to each other throughout, that there's an obvious parity between the child and their own retest. Sometimes the O&M researcher scored them higher, sometimes their own O&M specialist scored them higher, so there was not a consistent skew always in one direction, which was also nice to see. Test-retest correlations were calculated using Spearman's rho. They were all valid at the high stakes level, and they were all significant. So that was really reassuring. And the internal consistency using the split half reliability was measured with Spearman's Brown correction. And that's just a correction that tries to deal with that half of the test is not the same length as the whole test and kind of approximate back from that half to the full. It was taken off of the full data set of the 55 test scores. The reliability coefficients for the internal consistency ranged from 0.96 to 0.99 for every scale. So again, that's above the 0.9 threshold for high stakes. And the overall test tool, or the composite score, had a correlation of 0.99. So again, very strong. When exploring the subpopulations, I was really excited to see that everybody's average was kind of in that 40 ballpark and within the confidence intervals of the other domains. And I think this is really important to notice, because what this tells me when I see it is that the test of mobility skills is not accidentally a test of vision level. We're not seeing that the kids with low vision score way higher than the kids who are totally blind, or the kids who are CVI, or the kids who have multiple impairments. We're seeing that all of our kids have similar distributions and at least have similar averages, so that the test is not necessarily being skewed by the vision level itself. And so that's a really reassuring case that it could be that the test is actually testing orientation and mobility. This study didn't answer that, but this question looked for one threat against that, and the threat was not found. So that's wonderful. The findings of this study, all taken together, are largely that the B6OMSI research edition is reliable. It has an inter-rater reliability of 0.98 overall. The concept subscale and the Keynes scale were the weaker ones, and even they were sufficient for progress monitoring and research. They're 0.85 and 0.99, so there's still a very strong correlation. Though it would be interesting to see why it is those were the areas where two raters tended to differ on what they thought they were seeing. The test-retest reliability was also 0.99 overall, ranging from 0.92 to 0.98. This is an excellent measure of reliability and shows that even despite that there were months that went by between some of the retests, as a nature of pandemic shutdowns, instructors went back and tested kids after no service was provided because it was the pandemic, that even then we saw the same shape within a child. We saw very close correlations in terms of what their strengths were and what their weaknesses were, even with time separated. So that was very reassuring. And finally, that internal consistency was 0.99, which points under classical test theory to a reliable test tool. And then Once it was established that the tool was reliable, then I know it makes sense to aggregate all of those test scores that we get from different trained O&M specialists giving the tool, because if we have inter-rater reliability, I can trust that a score of 40 from one person and a score of 40 from another person are probably pretty similar. Then it was time to set up the data set for construct validity and really look at the statistics of, are these things scales and do they add up in a meaningful way? Construct validity is part of establishing that the test measures what it says it measures or measures what it means to. Some underlying trait is there that the test is actually getting at by measuring all of these observable things together. Having a valid test can save an O&M specialist time by removing wasted questions or repeated questions that might look different on the surface in the words they use, but actually test the same skill or trait. And item response theory establishes validity for every test item rather than for every population. And that makes it more robust against a heterogeneous population. I think it's important to remember that in the field of vision, a lot of times when tests have been suggested, there's been a pushback from the field that says, but I can't give the test one standard way to all of my students because each one of my students is different and they all need everything individualized. So developing our tests going forward out of an item response theory framework will help us build tests that are more robust to those differences and will still give kids a fair shot at a test if they're in one of the populations that the test works for. The research questions in the area of validity were really which items in the mobility scale are effectively contributing to the score, and which order should those items be placed in to best reflect their difficulty. To approach this, I started with Moken scaling. Moken scaling is a statistical method to look at whether items contribute to the score and measure all the same trait, rather than having a bunch of items in a list that measure different traits. A Moken scale is used for a non-parametric distribution, which again, our sample of kids is. And to do a full Moken scale analysis usually requires upwards of 250 to 500 tests, sometimes even more if you have more subgroups that you're interested in exploring. So for this, I aim to do a pilot study targeting 10% sample size to look at the feasibility of whether Moken scaling would work on this population and on this structure of a test, and figure out what sort of the statistical parametrics of this test were, and if they were going to fit the assumptions required to do Moken scaling before investing future time or money in carrying out that study on a full scale. For this, there were 40 kids in the test sample set, and 64 test scorebooks were generated. And for the statistical analysis, I used the Moken package in R statistical software. The first thing to explore is whether the items on one of the scales, again, looking at the mobility skills scale, fit one underlying trait. So really trying to get at, do all these items that people listed as measuring mobility skills measure some underlying invisible mobility trait that kids have? To understand these statistics, it's important to identify that the H is strong whenever it is greater than 0.5. And on this test, most of the item heterogeneity scores were greater than 0.6. The two exceptions were at the very highest level skills, the rides a bike type of skills, and the pilot sample was skewed young, so it's understandable that we didn't have very many kids who had reached any kind of score on that skill. So we might not have had enough sample in that area to test that. All of the other items, though, strongly fit under one unified scale and created a raw H score, or like a full scale score, of 0.88, which is definitely above our 0.5 threshold for a strong scale. The next task was to improve the order of item difficulty. This meant looking at how respondents answered the items based on their total score and their specific responses to every item. It was found that the order could be improved by moving 12 of the subskills later and 2 of the skill categories later. After reordering, the H score for the scale was 0.91, so it did improve the test slightly. Another way to look at that, this is a visual depiction of the same kind of information. So along the bottom here, we have each of the calculated skills, their prone skills, their sitting skills, crawling skills, pre-walking, standing, all the way up to their running and advanced skills. And the bars showing above and below are the range from the easiest observable skill that measures toward that category to the hardest measurable skill that measures toward that category. And so you can see that after item reordering, each of the categories is now in an order that gets progressively harder, and kind of the range band around them is also progressing upward with some natural overlap. A kid who's scoring at, say, 25 on there would be developing mid-level walking skills and also just starting to explore climbing and maybe even some beginning running skills. And that lines up with how we expect kids to develop movement. We don't expect a kid to have a fully mature adult gait before they take their first running step. So these sorts of overlaps make sense to how we know children develop. With the Moken scale analysis completed, another component of item response theory is it has its own measure of reliability that's not drawn on quite the same assumptions that classical test theory does. So looking at the item response theory measure of reliability, which is Moken's rho, that reliability measure came out at 0.99, indicating that this sort of process of measuring and improving the reliability and validity across multiple studies has yielded a very reliable test at the end as well. I think that this study is an early demonstration that validity is a possibility for this test and probably for others in our field. It gives us some evidence to support pursuing future grants in this domain to build out test tools to a full, valid, and reliable level based on actual data from blind kids, rather than just adopting tests out of populations that serve sighted kids. It demonstrates a feasibility of the methods, that the right sort of data are being gathered in this test, that a Moken scale analysis can work, and that it can improve the scale score. So we saw that test scale H score improve over the various iterations of the test, which tells me that this statistical method is helpful to improving our test and having a really strong tool that would be fair to kids. So how did the New Mexico then change to become the B6OMSI and ultimately the B6OMSI-RE? I think that was a little bit of politics and a whole lot of math. In the end, there are six new skills in the B6OMSI-RE that were not any part of the New Mexico, and that includes adding 24 observable subskills. The metrics for the measurement were clarified and changed throughout the process, and some of the items have been reordered based on the scaling. Scaling still needs to be done on some of the other scales to put them in better orders as well. This has left us with, for maybe the first time in our field, or maybe one of a couple emerging, a reliable and valid test. It's reliable. It's got a high inter-rater, test, retest, and internal consistency measures. And so far, it appears to be valid. It's got face validity and content validity, and at least a pilot study for construct validity that shows promise. This could be applied to other tests in our field. There's an adult version of the New Mexico that could be put through the process to become an adult tool for advanced skills. The expanded core curriculum in the field of blindness needs tests as well that are valid and reliable and not simply someone's personal checklist. And this sort of process could be repeated to gather from the experts who are actually teaching those skills in the field. What would inform their practice? What would be helpful to them? And how can we build that tool in a way that is also fair to their clients? It sets up a process for designing and refining assessments for our low incidence population. Like any study, this dissertation does have some limitations. Initially, it had set out to include a wide range or to explore a wide range of subpopulations. And in the end, we did not have enough deafblind kids in there to consider that population explored. That's a subpopulation that can't be ignored as data sets grow. It's important that they not be rejected as outliers, but rather be acknowledged as their own subpopulation and explored for their particular characteristics and needs. We continued to use Excel, which was at one point the best thing in the field, but it's not cutting edge anymore. It's not very portable. So I wonder if it's not time for an app development to be the next step for this sort of assessment tool so that professionals have their tools in their pocket. And also, this dissertation only worked with certified orientation and mobility specialists. I have not explored what items might be reliable if it were parents filling out the test or if it were other professionals, maybe related service providers filling out the test. And I think those would be questions that would help us better understand how to screen kids before O&M specialists get in the room. In the future, I hope to see this research carry on. I hope to be the one to carry on this research and look further at the construct validity, at whether the remaining sections are also statistical scales, and at anything that a larger data set might be able to tell us. I would love to look at non-professional reliability measures and develop a purposefully sampled screening tool. And in a longitudinal fashion, identify reference ranges and benchmarks that are built on blind kids to be truly for them, by them. At this time, I think this leaves us with a good tool, though. It's a tool that can be used for initial testing to establish a baseline or determine placement. It's a tool that can be used for progress monitoring. It's a tool that can evaluate our interventions or our program efficacy, because we can compare groups of children over time and see if the interventions are working. And because it's got good inter-rater reliability, we can aggregate data from this tool to further improve it in the future. Since it's showing that it's reliable and valid, I hope it will be widely used by trained O&M specialists. I would like to thank all of my committee members for your help and support over the course of this dissertation. Also, thanks to Dawn Anderson for identifying the need for this work in the beginning and twisting my arm mercilessly until I showed up to do the math. And all of our colleagues in New Mexico who participated so thoroughly in both generating the original tool and following through to collect data and beat the bushes to find more data when more kids were needed. So thank you all so much for your help. At this time, I would ask if there are questions or discussion. Yeah?
Yes.
Hi, Sarah Elizabeth. This is Kieran Fogarty. Nice presentation. I obviously read your paper too. It goes into much more detail there, which I certainly appreciated that. My question is, on your limitation page, you talked about this is certified. You feel pretty comfortable with the O&M certified people using this particular test. You also kind of referenced that other professionals may be using this test as well. How frequent is that, or parents, is that common?
I don't think it's common practice right now. But one of the things that I think happens in the field of vision is the O&M specialist is oftentimes the last person to the table. A kid is receiving services from speech and from OT when they're very young children. Their family is receiving services rather and receiving supports. And sometimes it's a long time before anybody calls an O&M specialist and says, hey, I think this kid is delayed in walking. And so the question is, what can we equip early intervention teams with that they don't have to know the whole scope and spectrum of orientation and mobility to have a screening tool that makes sense for them and that makes a meaningful handoff of information of, hey, we checked on the quick tool, we think there's a concern, and the O&M specialist have a good sense that, yes, I can see that there is a concern, or I can tell you that that's really typical development for these kids.
A quick follow-up question, if I can take the moment then. Also, it's from birth to 6. Obviously, there's a lot of different developmental issues between birth and 6. And so was that a confounder at all?
Yeah. So I think that the birth to 6 span of this, rather than birth to 3, is really intentional and purposeful. I think there was a clear goal in the minds of the first creators of it to establish something that would take a kid from when we first pick up their family in early intervention through the first year of public school and that handoff to the new environment. Because orientation and mobility needs to always be teaching the skills for right now and the skills you'll need to not start next year behind, that this kind of got through one long set of transition after transition, because kids don't get a break from development at any point in there. There's no stable moment when a kid is 4 and they're like, great, I got my skills, I'll see you next year. They're changing every day and they need to learn the next thing so quickly that this would see them through all the way to the handoff to school age. And then that school age one can see them through all the way the rest of the lifespan.
Okay, thank you.
Elizabeth, I have a question for you as well. By the way, a lot of hard work went into this over a long period of time. Very nicely done.
Thank you.
You mentioned, I think around page 50 or so, that there really wasn't any data from 4 to 5-year-olds and that some test items couldn't be demonstrated or weren't demonstrated. What is the impact on that in regard to validity?
Yeah, I think the impact on having some items that were not demonstrated in the sample population is that it would be inappropriate to throw those items out based on the sample population. So what that means is if we had a full sample of 500 kids and the H scores on bicycling were showing at 0.2, that's below 0.3, which is the minimum for a scale, we'd say, take those items off the test, they don't fit. In this case, I think it's more appropriate to say, they're not showing up on the test right now, but they're also not showing up in the sample right now. This is evidence that we need more kids who have that skill developed to be included in the sample so we can understand when sequentially kids develop that skill. And if what we find is that that skill, the way it's measured on the test, doesn't emerge until age 10, then it needs to be taken off the scale and moved. But if what we find is that when we have 25 5-year-olds in the sample instead of just a handful, if 15 of them have the skill, we can more clearly understand and rerun that H value and see if it changes to something that's on the scale or if it's still its own subscale and needs to be moved. So I think just because there's a paired problem in the sample data, we have to be conservative and not throw the baby out with the bathwater quite yet.
Okay, that's very helpful. I want to ask one more question. I noticed, in reading the paper that you had mentioned that there was a 1-hour training period for the individuals that were administering the test.
Yeah.
If this test is to be used by O&M specialists within the field, can you talk a little bit more about that training? Can that be shortened? What components would you recommend be a part of that training?
Yeah. So that training is in the format of a 30-minute output and then about 30 minutes of practice scoring activities where we'd show a video clip and everyone in the room rates it on their score. And we're trying to build up people's confidence and sense in rating things consistently. In terms of building that out, I certainly think that sort of training can be recorded and placed into the website where you would get the tool from. Or in the case of building an app, could be built in to the app as an outgoing training. I think it should also be built in as item by item support, where you can click on the help button or the more information button and see examples of what does a 5 look like on this skill? What does a 3 look like on this specific skill? What do we call a 1 in this specific skill? So that we could put less of a obligation on, we trust at the very start, as a result of your training, that you know how to handle all of the range of kids you're always going to see, and build in more scaffolding and support for the kind of on-the-fly learning that professionals really need to do to keep up with their big and busy jobs.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Let's hold questions from committee members at this point and let any non-committee members ask any of their questions. And then we'll get a chance as a committee to ask Sarah Elizabeth more in-depth questions.
So I'm obviously I'm on a committee, but this is more of a general question, Dr. Wall. This is a question for Sarah. We've been asking all our presenters the last year or so. So obviously, Sarah Elizabeth, you have an interdisciplinary health science doctorate. So what about your project, which you can share with us, that has an interdisciplinary component?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the use of a tool that is initially developed by a collaboration between orientation and mobility specialists and physical therapists is one of those areas. I think the collaboration with early intervention teams is another one, because our early intervention teams are never just one profession, and they never serve just the child, they serve the whole family, which is another great bridging point. And I think kind of that long look toward, in the future, it would be great to make this a tool that has a version appropriate for people without the same background training, is again an eye toward what does our full team need? And it's not just the orientation and mobility specialist, but it's the environment and the teams that they serve on who also need this kind of support and work done to serve them.
Any questions from anyone else?
So,
Yeah.
how long would it take for an O&M specialist to actually score a kid using this instrument?
How long? The question is, how long does it take for an O&M specialist to actually score a kid on this test tool? The average answer is an hour and 15 minutes, I would say. The scope of that answer is sometimes a kid's full score can be obtained in 30 to 45 minutes, especially when it's a retest, when it's a kid that the specialist knows well, when they have an established pattern of skills. And the long answer is a new initial eval for a kid who's kind of got some really strong strengths and some really weak weaknesses, and you never know what you're going to get next. You can be looking at 2.5 hours of testing to do the full packet on a complex kid. So that's about your range, but a lot of professionals we saw give it in an hour and 15 minutes. Mm-hmm.
So my question is, what's next? We would like to take this research to move towards valid, reliable tools in the field of O&M. Can you lay out what you believe the next couple steps will be, the next 3 steps?
Sure. What are the next 3 steps for this research line? I think the next 3 steps for this research line are to write for either an IES assessment grant like the one that was used to explore the TILs, or to write for a Stepping Up Technology grant for the app development component of moving the test forward. I think with grant funding and some better technology, the goal should be to collect 500 kids worth of data and make sure that there are 50 kids who are blind, and that there are 50 kids who are deafblind, and that there are 50 kids with CVI, and that there are 50 kids with low vision somewhere in that pool, so that you can really thoroughly explore the validity for specific subpopulations and say, not just it appears that this test is valid for our heterogeneous group, but also say it is specifically valid for this group that is likely to be concerned about whether or not it's for them, that we need to really address each of those questions directly. And that requires a larger data set, and a larger data set requires the better data collection of an application or something that can dump numbers anonymously into a database.
Sarah Elizabeth, I have a question. This is Sophia.
Yeah, Sophia.
Did you find in your study any skills that should be added to the OMSI-RE?
Yes, we did. The skills that should be added, and they have been added to the version that you now have on the website. The skills that should be added are the ordinal sequencing, the use of landmarks for orientation, the use of technology, which was added to the background page, the exploration of gross motor skills, so that development of kicking a ball and whatnot, the exploration of objects tactily. We had tactile mapping on there, but we didn't have tactile object exploration. So that section got added. And then proprioception, or that awareness of where a person's body is and where it's moving. Those skills got added as well under perceptual. Traffic awareness is the last one. And traffic awareness does not refer to a kid being safe to walk in a street when they're 4 years old, but just being aware that there's a difference between sidewalk spaces and street spaces where cars go. And those items have been added to the tool that's currently hosted on your website, or that you used in studies 2 and 3. So they've already been incorporated in.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have a question. So how many of these items do you see as appropriate for you to be used for adults as well?
So the question is, how many of these items are appropriate for use with adults as well? And I'm tempted to say none of them in this format. That the adult version of kind of this family of tools, the next step tool, starts over with a quick assessment of basic skills that is much more age appropriate than going back to crawling skills or going back to holds an object for 30 seconds. There's still a way that that assessment tool is getting at, does this person have the hand strength and coordination to hold a long cane? But it's not broken down the way you would break it down on a developmental test to test a 3-year-old. And I think it's important that we don't infantilize adults with blindness, that we would not want to adopt from the infancy tool the way that we measure that for adults. I think we want to measure it for adults the way that's appropriate for adults rather than import the skills. So I really do think that this tool stops at age 6 and you pick up the next tool and start there with the next age bracket of tool. I feel really passionately about that for, say, the 10-year-old who's got significant multiple impairments, that we still want to be testing the 10-year-old with significant disabilities using a tool appropriate for 10-year-olds, not on a tool appropriate for babies and toddlers because someone has said they're functioning at an 18-month level. That's not necessarily respectful to the person's age and lived experience. That this one really is birth to 6, and that's where it ends. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I may have missed it, but what was the geographical range of your sample?
Great question. The question was, what was the geographical range? So for the Delphi study, we had participants from the US, Australia, the UK, Ireland, So quite a range on where the experts came from. And then the children's samples are all from the USA and Canada, with a heavy, heavy bias toward the upper Midwest and the Southwest.
All right, well, thank you very much. Well done. I think that I will ask non-committee members now to exit virtually and reality-wise. And the committee will chat with Sarah Elizabeth.
I have no idea.